Hey, what's up, my little crime freaks, and welcome back to a brand new episode of Mostly Crime with My, a podcast where you and I get together once a week to discuss all things creepy, sneaky, and downright freaky. I'm your host, Maya, and for those of you who are new here, welcome. There has been like 150 new subscribers on the YouTube channel this last week, and so I don't know where you came from, but what I do know is that I am so grateful to each and every one of you for being here, for supporting my channel, and to those of you who have been leaving really nice comments and emails and likes and just showing love and support for the channel. It means a really great deal to me because I love to do these videos. I love to provide you guys with entertainment and stories. And so just knowing that it entertains you guys as much as it pleases me to make these videos is everything. And for those of you who aren't huge fans of the channel, I've actually enabled this feature on my channel called the exit button. So you can go to the top left corner and click it. Alternatively, you can use the search engine on YouTube to just literally type in a different video. So if you're feeling like oddly inclined to leave a negative comment, you definitely don't have to. That feature is not mandatory. So just wanted to clarify that. Now, this week, we are going to be getting into part 4 of a series that we started last week called the Reddit Stories That Keep Me Up at Night. Now, these aren't unrelated stories. They are all related stories that a user named 1000 Vultures released in 2011. And last week, we covered parts 1, 2, and 3. And this week, we'll be covering part 4 to the stories. So there actually is a lot more than 4 parts to these stories, but they are very long. And honestly, I think this would take up like a month's worth of content. So I'm just going to leave the link below and you guys can read the remaining stories. But this one I thought was worth telling on the channel. So let's get right into it. There was a comment in the last post that made me remember an event from my childhood that I always thought as odd but never considered it to be related to any of these stories. I now know that it is. It's funny how memories work. The details might all be present in your mind, though scattered and disarrayed, and then a single thought can stitch them back together most instantly. I never thought of these events as much because I was focused on the wrong details. I went back to my mom's house and went through my old childhood schoolwork looking for something that I think is important. I couldn't find it, but I'll keep looking. Again, sorry for the length. Most old cities and the neighborhoods in them weren't planned with much thought that the population would begin to grow exponentially and that it would have to be accommodated. The layout of the roads is generally originally in response to geographical restrictions and the necessity of connecting points of economic importance. Once the connecting roads are established, the new business and roads are positioned strategically along the existing skeleton. And eventually the paths carved into each other are immortalized in asphalt, leaving room for only minor modifications, additions, and alterations, but never a dramatic change. My childhood neighborhood must have been old then. If straight lines move as the crow flies, then my neighborhood must have been built based on the travels of a snake. The first houses built must have been placed around the lake, and gradually the inhabitable area increased as new extensions were built off the original path. But these new extensions all ended abruptly at one point or another. There was only one entrance or exit for the entire neighborhood. Many of these extensions were limited by a tributary, which both fed and drank from the lake and passed right by what I came to call, and have still called in these stories, the ditch. Many of the original homes had enormous yards, but some of those original plots had been divided, leaving properties with smaller and smaller boundaries. An aerial view of my neighborhood would give some the impression that an enormous squid had once died in the woods, and some adventuring entrepreneur found the corpse and paved roads over its tentacles, only to withdraw its involvement and leave time, greed, and desperation to divide up the land among prospective homeowners, like an embarrassing attempt at the golden ratio. From my porch, you could see the old houses that surrounded the lake, but the houses of Miss Maggie was my favorite. She was, as best as I can remember, around 80 years old, but despite that, she was one of the friendliest people I had ever met. She had a head with white curls and always wore light dresses with floral patterns. She would talk to me and Josh from her back porch when we were swimming in the lake, and she would always invite us in for snacks. She said that she was lonely because her husband Tom was always away on business, but Josh and I would always decline her invitation because, as nice as Miss Maggie was, there was still something a bit odd about her. Every now and then we would swim, and she would say, "Chris and John, you're welcome to come here anytime." and we could hear her still yelling that when we were walking back to my house. Mrs. Maggie, like many of the older homeowners, had a sprinkler system that was on a timer, though at some point over the years her timer must have broken because the sprinklers would come on at various points during the day and often even at night all year round. While it never got cold enough to snow very much, several times a year in the winter I would go outside in the morning to see Mrs. Maggie's yard transformed into a surreal Arctic paradise by the frozen water. Every other yard stood sterilized and dry by the biting frost of the winter's cold. But right there in the middle of a bleak reminder of the savagery of the season was an oasis of beautiful ice, hanging from every branch of the tree and every leaf of every bush. As the sun rose, it reflected off of each piece of ice, and it splintered the sun into a rainbow that would only be viewed briefly before it blinded you. Even as a child, I was struck by how beautiful it was, and often Josh and I would go over there to walk on the iced grass and have sword fights with the icicles. I once asked my mom why she left it on like that. My mom seemed to search for the answer in her explanation before she said, "Well, sweetie, Miss Maggie is sick a lot, and sometimes when she gets really sick, she gets confused. That's why she messes up yours and Josh's names sometimes. She doesn't mean to, but sometimes she just can't remember. She lives in that big old house by herself, so it's okay if you talk to her when you swim in the lake, but when she invites you in, I would keep saying no. Be polite, her feelings won't get hurt." But she'll be less lonely when her husband comes home though, right? How long will he be away on business? It seems like he's always away. My mom seemed to struggle, and I could see that she had become very upset. But finally she answered, "Honey, Tom's not going to come home. Tom's in heaven. He died years and years ago, but Miss Maggie just doesn't remember. She gets confused and forgets, but Tom's not ever coming home. If someone moved back in with her, she might even think it was Tom. But he's gone, sweetie." I would have been only around 5 or 6 when she told me that, and while I didn't understand it completely, I was still profoundly sad for Miss Maggie. I know now that Mrs. Maggie had Alzheimer's, but she and her husband Tom had had 2 sons, Chris and John. The 2 had worked out payment plans with the utility companies and paid for Miss Maggie's water and electricity, but they would never visit her. I don't know if something happened between them or if it was the illness or if they just lived too far away, but they never came around. And I have no idea what they look like, but there were times when Miss Maggie must have thought Josh and I looked like they did when we were children, or maybe she saw what some part of her mind so desperately wanted to see, ignoring the images transmitted down her optic nerve and just for a while showing her what it used to be. I realize only now how lonely that really must have been. During the summer after kindergarten, before the events of balloons, Josh and I had taken to exploring the woods near my house, as well as the tributary of the lake. We knew that the woods between our houses were connected, and we thought it would be neat if the lake near my house was somehow connected to the creek near his, so we resolved ourselves to find out. We were going to make maps. The plan was to make 2 separate maps and then combine them. We would make one map exploring the area around the creek near his house, and another following the outflow from my lake. Originally, we were going to make one map, but we realized that this wasn't possible since I had started drawing the map of my area so huge that the route from his house wouldn't have been to scale. We kept the map from the lake at my house and the map from the creek at his house, and we would add to each of these every time we stayed the night with one another. For the first couple of weeks it went really well. We would walk through the woods along the water and pause every couple of minutes to add to the map, and it seemed like there were 2 maps that were really coming together any day now. We had no equipment needed for the job, not even a compass, but we tried to make do. We had the idea to impale the earth with a stick when we had reached the end of a venture, so that if we came upon the stick from another direction the next weekend, that we would know we had joined the maps. We might have been the world's worst cartographers. Eventually, however, the woods became too thick near the water coming from the lake, and we were unable to proceed further. We lost interest in the whole project for a bit and reduced our exploration significantly, though not completely, when we started selling snow cones. After I showed my mom all the pictures I had taken home from school and she took away my snow cone machine, our interest in the maps revitalized. We had to come up with another plan. Although I didn't understand why, my mom had placed what I considered to be extremely severe restrictions on what I could do and where I could go, and I had to check in frequently if I went outside to play with Josh. This meant that we couldn't stay in the woods for hours and continue to look for a new path. We thought that we could just swim when we got to the cutoff in the woods, but that clearly wouldn't work since the map wouldn't get wet. We tried going faster when we were coming to Josh's house, but we eventually ran into the same problem. Then we had a brilliant idea. We could build a raft. Due to the construction in the neighborhood, there was a large amount of scrap building material that the company would set in the ditch to keep it out of the road and off-site since they no longer needed it for building. We originally conceived of a formidable ship, complete with a mast and an anchor, but it quickly diminished into something more manageable. We set aside the wood and took several large pieces of styrofoam that were backed up from a foam board and tied them together with a rope and a kite string. We launched our vessel a little down the water from Mrs. Maggie's house and waved a farewell to her as she motioned us to come back her way. But there was no stopping us. The raft worked very well, and while we both behaved and spoke as if the functionality of the raft was a given, I know at least I was a little surprised. We each had a fairly long tree branch to use as a paddle, but we found it was easier to simply push against the land under the water than actually use it as intended. When the water became too deep, we simply lie on our stomachs and we would use our hands to paddle the water, which still worked, albeit a little bit less. The first time we had to resort to that method, I remember thinking that from far above it must have looked like a colossally fat man with tiny arms out for a swim. It actually took us several trips to raft the impassable patch of woods that marked the farthest we had made it. After we had come up with the idea of marking the ground with a stick, we had taken to running through the woods until we got the stick and then, as carefully and precisely as we knew how, charting our course. This meant that the impasse was actually quite a bit away, so to sail from around my house all the way to the blockade in the woods was taking longer than expected. We'd sail for a bit and then dock the raft, and then the next time we'd run through the woods to the raft and go a little further. We continued this well into the first grade. Josh and I were assigned to different groups that year, so since we didn't really see one another during the school day, our parents were more than willing to let us hang out all weekend each week. What's more, Josh's dad had taken on a lengthy construction job that required him to work over the weekends, and his mother was on call, so this meant that Josh would stay at my house most every weekend for weeks on end. We should have been making excellent progress, but when we finally made it to the impasse and had the opportunity to explore past it, we couldn't find a place to dock the raft. The woods were simply too thick, and the water had eroded the land to the point that there was nearly a 2-foot rise of the earth over the tributary, which exposed the twisting and damp roots of the trees above. We'd have to turn back every time and leave the raft at the same thick of trees that prompted us to build it in the first place. Even worse, winter had arrived, so we couldn't justify leaving the house in our swimsuits. We were getting nowhere. We always had to come home before we could gain on much ground. On a Saturday, around 7 p.m., Josh and I were playing when my mom's coworker knocked on the door. Her name was Samantha, and I remember her well now because I would propose to her a couple years later when I was visiting my mom at work. My mom said that she had to go to work to fix a problem that had arisen, and she'd be back in 2 hours. Her car was being repaired, so she'd have to get a ride with Samantha, but I gathered that the problem was Samantha's fault, and discussing it in the car was why it would take them 2 hours. She said that under no circumstances were we to leave the house or open the door for anyone, and she was in the middle of explaining that she would call every hour when she got in there to check on us, but she ended that statement prematurely when she remembered that our phone had been turned off for delinquent payments. That is why Samantha came by unannounced. She looked me dead in the eyes, and she was closing the door and said, "Stay put." This was our chance. We watched her drive down the road toward the exit, and as soon as the car rounded the last visible bend, we ran back to my mom. I dumped my backpack out while Josh grabbed the map. "Hey, do you have a flashlight?" Josh chimed. "No, but we'll be back before dark." "Well, I was just thinking just in case we should have one." My mom has one, but I don't know where she keeps it." "Wait." I ran into my closet and pulled the box down from the top shelf. "You have a flashlight in there?" Josh asked. "Not exactly." I opened the box and revealed 3 Roman candles. I opened the box and revealed 3 Roman candles that I had taken from a pile that my mother had amassed for the 4th of July the past summer, along with a lighter that I had managed to take from her some months before. This would ensure that we at least had some light if we needed it. This was a little bit before I had been given the opportunity to be afraid of the woods at night, so it wasn't fear that motivated our search for the light source, only practicality. We threw it all in the backpack and bolted our way out the doors, making sure to close it so that boxes wouldn't get out. We had 1 hour and 50 minutes. We ran through the woods as fast as we could and made it to the raft in about 15 minutes. We had our bathing suits on under our clothes, so we stripped off our shirts and shorts and left them in 2 separate piles about 4 feet from the edge of the water. We untied the raft from the tree, grabbed our branches and paddles, and cast off. We tried to move rapidly to reach a point beyond the contents of our ever-expanding maps, as we didn't have time to waste seeing old sites. We knew that we were slower in the raft than on land, and that we would be in the raft for quite a while after the cutoff since the woods were too thick to walk through and there wasn't a space to place our dock. This meant that we'd have to ride the raft back to the original docking site, even if we found a new place to dock it further ahead. After we passed the last charted part of the map, the water began to get really deep and eventually we could no longer touch the bottom with our tree branches, so we lay on our stomachs and started paddling with our hands. It was getting darker and as a result it was becoming harder to distinguish the trees from one another and we were both becoming slightly unnerved. In the interest of making good time, we were paddling so fast with our arms, but this caused a lot of noise as our hands repeatedly confronted and then broke through the water's surface tension. During these periods, we could both hear the crunching of dead leaves and then snapping of fallen sticks in the woods to our right. As we would slow our pace and quiet our actions, the rustling of the woods would cease, and we began to wonder if it was really ever there at all. We didn't know what kinds of animals resided this far into the woods, but we did know that we didn't wish to find out. As Josh amended the map and I was illuminating with the lighter, we were suddenly confronted by the fact that the sounds were not imagined. Rapidly and rhythmically, we heard crunch, snap, crunch. It seemed to be moving slightly away from us, pushing through the woods just beyond our map. It had become too dark to see, and we had misjudged how long the sun would be lingering. Nervously, I called out, "Hello?" There was a brief moment of breathless tension as we lay static in the water. The silence suddenly broke by laughter. "Hello?" Josh crackled. "So what?" "Hello, Mr. Monster in the Woods? I know you're sneaking around there, but maybe you'll answer to my hello, hello?" I realized how stupid it was. Whatever animal it was, it wouldn't respond. I hadn't even realized I'd said it until afterwards, but if anything was actually there, I obviously wouldn't get a reply. Josh continued. "Hello?" with his high falsetto. "Hello," I encountered with a deep baritone as I could manage. "Hello there, mate." "Hello, beat bop." "Hello." We continued mocking each other, and we were in the process of turning the raft around to head back when we heard, "Hello." It was whispered and forced, as if it were powered by the last breath in a pair of deflating lungs, but it didn't sound sickly. It had come from a spot just off the map, which now sat behind us since we had turned the raft around. I slowly shifted on the raft and faced the direction of the sound as I fumbled with the Roman candle. I wanted to see. "What are you doing?" Josh hissed. But I had already lit it. As a sparkling fuse sunk into the wrapper, I held it toward the sky. I had never actually shot one of these myself and thought to just use it like a flare in these movies. A glowing green orb rocketed out toward the stars and then quickly extinguished. I lowered my arm more toward the horizon. I could remember that there were several colors, but couldn't remember how many times one of these fired before being depleted. A second ball of red burst out and fizzled above the trees, but I still saw nothing. "Let's just go, man," Josh pressed, as he turned his face the direction back home and began paddling desperately. "Just one more." Lowering my arm directly at the woods in front of me, another red ball of fire was launched from the tube. It traveled straight ahead until it coiled with a tree, briefly exploding the light in a much greater diameter. Still nothing. I dropped the firework in the water and watched as one more struggling fireball burst free, only to quickly die, suffocated by the water. As we began paddling in direction toward my house, we heard a loud and unconcealed rustling in the woods. The breaking of branches and the trampling of fallen leaves overpowered the sound of our splashing. It was running. In our panic, we jostled the raft too violently and I felt one of the ropes under my chest loosen. "Josh, just be careful." But it was too late. Our raft was breaking, and before too long I had completely fallen apart. We each held on to separate pieces of styrofoam, but the pieces weren't big enough to keep us completely afloat, and our legs dangled beneath us in the winter water. "Josh, quick!" I yelled as I pointed to the water right next to him. He scrambled, but it was too cold to move quickly, and we both watched as a map floated away. "I'm cold, man," Josh shuddered. "Let's get out of this water." We approached the shore, but each time we attempted to pull ourselves up, we'd hear the frantic rustling thundering towards us from the woods just above. Eventually, we were too cold and weak to even try anymore. Steadily, we kicked our legs and found ourselves nearing the dock site, toppled off the debris, and tried to pull it on the land. But Josh's piece slipped away and floated into the direction of the lake. We took off our swimsuits and were desperate to get into dry clothes to shield us from the biting chill of the air. I slid my shorts, but there was something wrong. I turned to Josh. "Where's my shirt, man?" He shrugged and suggested, "Maybe it got knocked into the water and floated off onto the lake." I told Josh to go back to my house and say that we were playing hide and seek if my mom was home. I had to try and find my shirt. I ran behind the houses and peered out over the water and scouted along the shoreline. It occurred to me that with any luck I could find the map too. I was moving pretty fast, but I needed to get home and was about to give up when my concentration was interrupted by a sound coming from just behind me. "Hello." I whipped around. It was Miss Maggie. I had never seen her at night before, and in this poor light she looked exceedingly frail. The usual warmth that wrapped her manner seemed to be snuffed by the chill. I could even remember seeing her without a smile, and her face looked so strange. "Hello, Miss Maggie." "Oh, hi, Chris." The warmth and smile returned to her. "I couldn't see it was you in the dark." Jokingly, I asked her if she was going to invite me in for a snack, but she said maybe another time. I was too busy looking for my map and the shirt to really engage her, but she sounded happy, so I didn't feel bad. She said a couple other things, but I was too distracted to pay any attention. I said goodnight and ran down her driveway toward my house. Behind me, I could even hear her walking across the frozen yard, but I didn't turn around to wave. I had to get home. I made it home a couple minutes before my mom did, and by the time she came in, Josh and I had already changed clothes and warmed up. We'd gotten away with it, even though we'd lost the map. Couldn't find it? Nah, but I saw Miss Maggie. She called me Chris again. I'm telling you, dude, just be glad that you never saw her at night. We both laughed, and he asked if she invited me in for a snack, joking that the snacks must be terrible since she couldn't even give them away. I told him that she didn't, and he was surprised, and now that I had time to think about it, so was I. Literally every time we had seen her, she had invited us in for snacks, and here I had, albeit sarcastically, invited myself, and she said no. As Josh and I talked more about Miss Maggie, I suddenly realized that the lighter might still be in my pocket, and that it would be disastrous for my mom to find it. I grabbed my shorts from off the floor and patted my pockets. I felt something. It wasn't the lighter. From my back pocket, I slid out a folded piece of paper and my heart leapt. The map? I thought. But I watched it float away. As I unfolded the paper, my stomach turned as I tried to understand what I was seeing. Drawn on the paper, inside of a large oval, were two stick figures holding hands. One was much bigger than the other, but neither had faces. The paper was torn, so a part of it was missing, and there was a number written near the top corner. It was either 15 or 16. I nervously handed the paper to Josh and asked him if he had put it in my pocket at some point, but he scoffed at the idea and asked why I was so upset. I pointed toward the smaller stick figure and what was written next to it. It was my initials. I shook it off and told Josh the rest of the conversation between Mrs. Maggie and I. I had always attributed the odd exchanges to her being sick until revisiting the events in my mind all these years later. As I think about it now, the feeling of profound sadness of Mrs. Maggie returns, but is augmented by a looming feeling of despair when I think about why she said, maybe another time. I knew what she had said, but I didn't understand what it meant that night. I didn't understand what her words had meant weeks later when I watched men in strange orange suits, biohazard suits, carry what I thought were big black bags of garbage out of her house, or why the whole neighborhood smelled like death that day. I still didn't understand when they condemned the house and boarded it up a little while before we moved, but I understand now. I understood why her last words to me were so important, even if neither she or I realized it at the time. Miss Maggie had told me that night that Tom had come home, but I know now who had really moved in, just as I know why I never saw her body brought out onto a stretcher. The bags weren't filled with garbage. So basically, Mrs. Maggie was convinced that night that Tom had come home. Somebody did go to her house. Somebody or something went to her house, but it definitely wasn't Tom. That story, the ending is just so freaky considering all the things that led up to this. Like, there's just something or someone lingering around in his life, and everything he does and every experience he has is somehow linked back to this mysterious someone or something. And I say something because in my mind, my imagination, it doesn't seem like it's a person. It seems too eerie, it seems too sinister to be a person. But I am so interested to see what you guys thought about part 4 to this series. As I mentioned, there are a lot of other videos that I could make about the ongoing stories that he posts that are kind of connected to his childhood, but there are just so many of them, and I don't know if you guys want me to keep making videos on that. I just found the story so freaky, and it's so interesting because every story is so perfectly aligned, and if this guy isn't an author and these stories are just something he's making up, like, that blows my mind. Because, you know, I know a lot of people were like, oh, these Reddit stories aren't true and what have you. I know a lot of these stories aren't true, and I know this guy is claiming they're true, and that doesn't really mean anything. But what blows my mind is that if they aren't true, imagine how good your imagination and your storytelling has to be to piece all of these things together the way he did, and it's just insane. So like a part of me is like wanting to believe they're true. You know, the creepy part of me, the part that's entertained by all this, wants to believe that it's true. Well, guys, with all of that being said, I am so curious to see what you think about these videos and about what you thought about 1,000 Vultures and his stories. I'm really loving the storytelling of these creepy Reddit stories. So as I always ask, if you have any creepy stories that you want me to tell, then let me know. But I also thought that for next week's video, we could make things a little bit more fun. And I asked that you all comment what case you would like me to cover next week, whether it's a true crime case, a paranormal case, a dark conspiracy case, whatever it is, whatever your little heart desires, leave it in the comment section. What I will do is I will generate all the comments into a randomizer, pick a name, and whatever your comment says for that username, that's the video topic that we will discuss for the following week. So we'll try this out. We'll see how it goes. We might just keep doing it because I think it's a great way to give you guys the content that you want. The more likes that a comment has, the more times we can put that person's name in the randomizer. So I leave it to you to leave your comments. I look forward to providing you with content that you're really interested in. And again, thank you so much for all of your support and your love. I love doing this. I have fun doing this, and I'm so glad that you enjoy watching and listening. So we will see you guys next week in another episode of Mostly Crime with Mai.